Good afternoon, and welcome to the William Kittredge Lifetime Achievement Award panel. His lifetime achievements are ongoing, and so we're happy to have all of you here today, and happiest of all to have Bill. And I'm Robert Stubblefield. I teach at the University of Montana, and I'll start by introducing our fellow panelists. Beginning immediately to my right is Deborah Magpie Erling. She teaches fiction at the University of Montana. Her novel Perma Red won the Western Writers Association Spur Award, the Western Writers Association Medicine Pipe Bearer Award for Best First Novel, a Willow Literary Award, and the American Book Award. The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, a collaboration with photographer Peter Rutledge Koch, reinvents the life of Sacagawea. Erling's publications also include The Last Best Place, Talking Leaves, Circle of Women, and Wild Women, anthology of women writers. She is a recipient of a 2007 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2015 Governor Arts Award. Kim Zupan is a native Montanan who grew up in and around Great Falls, where much of his novel, The Plowman, is set. Winner of the 2014 Montana Book Award, The Plowman was released by Holt and has been published through HarperCollins Canada and by Picador in the United Kingdom, as well as translated into French, German, and Korean. His stories have appeared in Epic and the Big Sky Journal and have been anthologized in Where We Live, Hunting's Best Short Stories, The New Montana Story, and the Best of Montana's Short Fiction. For 25 years, Zupan made a living as a carpenter while pursuing his writing. He's also worked as a smelter man, pro-rodeo bareback rider, ranch hand, Alaska salmon fisherman, and until recently taught carpentry at Missoula College, University of Montana. He holds an MFA from the University of Montana. To Kim's right is Sean McDermott. Sean holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Montana and is the last student to have Bill Kittredge serve on her thesis committee. But that may not be true for long. Bill might take up thesis work again. So. She works as a freelance writer in Butte, Montana, where she lives in the historic uptown with her husband and daughter. And to Sean's right is Dee McNamer. Dee McNamer is the author of the novels Rima in the Weeds, One Sweet Quarrel, My Russian, and Red Rover, which was named a Best Book of 2007 by Artforum, The Washington Post, and the LA Times. Her stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, Double Take, New York Times Opinion Page, and elsewhere. McNamer teaches graduate and undergraduate writing workshops and a graduate course in techniques at the University of Montana. And finally, to Dee's right, is William Kittredge. Bill taught creative writing for 30 years at the University of Montana. He is the author of 2 collections of short fiction, The Van Gogh Field, and Other Stories, and We Are Not in This Together. A novel, The Willow Field, a memoir, Hole in the Sky, and 3 collections of essays, Owning It All, Who Owns the West, and The Next Rodeo, New and Selected Essays. He has received a Stagner Fellowship, 2 NEA fellowships, the Los Angeles Times Award for Lifetime Achievement, the National Humanities Award, Montana Governor's Award for the Arts, Montana Governor's Award for the Humanities, and numerous other awards. As you know, he was co-editor with Onyx Smith of The Last Best Place, a Montana anthology. His work has appeared in Atlantic, Harper's, Esquire, Time, Newsweek, The Washington Post, and the New York Times. And so each of us up here are going to say a few words about Bill and his work and its influence on us individually and finally collectively, I guess. And then after we wrap that up, we'll take some questions. And so why don't we go ahead and open, we can go down the order we just had, or if anybody wants to just start. Well, I'll go ahead and start, and we'll just go in order then. Is that okay? Okay. Roland Barthes wrote, "Literature is the question minus the answer." F. Scott Fitzgerald paraphrased or added, "The work of fiction is not to provide the answer, but to pose the question correctly." Coming of age as a reader in Eastern Oregon, it was rare to recognize the places you knew or the people you might encounter in fiction. With rare exceptions, what was written about the region mostly contained the torpid, provincial certitudes resulting from a desperate need to prove something or someone right. My first semester in college, Michael Kepler, my intro to lit professor, said, "If you want to write, you should really read this." And he handed me a photocopied story titled The Waterfowl Tree. Early in that story is the following passage. "That's the rim," his father said. "We'll be home directly." The boy looked again at the black fault. How could this be home, this place under that looming wall? "All my life," the man said, "in strange places, I've caught myself looking up and expecting to see that rim. How could this be home, this place under that looming wall?" That's precisely the kind of question that leaves you wanting more of these stories and sends you to the bookstore for We Are Not in This Together. In the foreword, Raymond Carver writes of Bill's characters, "Besides, where most of them live, the big city newspapers, the papers from Seattle or Spokane or Portland or San Francisco are a day late getting there. And so the gloomy horoscopes are a confirmation rather than a prediction." And that's just about a perfect description of these characters and their lives. It was liberating to realize that you didn't need answers to write, only a few questions to get started. And that you didn't necessarily need to have traveled widely or gone on safari, but just look closely at the people and places you loved and didn't quite understand. And none of this is to imply that you need to be from Eastern Oregon or the West to appreciate Bill's work. That's just where I got started. I know readers and students from London, New York, Ohio, Chicago. All of them appreciate and admire Bill's work as much as I do. His work addresses those questions people face wherever they're from. His work is of a place, not necessarily about a place. Later on, Craig Leslie, my first creative writing teacher, suggested I consider the University of Montana's MFA program. By that time, Bill had solidified his position as a powerful voice of the West with Owning It All and Hole in the Sky. And it seemed almost inconceivable that I could come to Missoula and study with the author of The Waterfowl Tree. So I've been lucky to know Bill first as his reader, later as student, and now as his friend. And I'm thrilled to be here today with your family and friends to celebrate your work and generous presence in our community, Bill.
Thank you, Robert. Very generous of you.
I tried to write something about Bill, and I was going over his work, and I thought any words pale in comparison, so I thought I'd read a few. I was going to read some of his sexier blurbs, but I thought I'd read a few ones that aren't X-rated. So here's some of my favorites. Our old pilgrims, Bill writes in the Hole in the Sky, believed stories in which the West was a promise, a place where decent people could escape the wreckage of failed lives and start over. Come along, the dream whispers, and you can have another chance. We still listen to the promises in the wind. This time we think we'll get it right. And this is from Who Owns the West, and I've always been kind of astonished by Bill's vision, and he is the voice of the West. It's undeniable. But this seems particularly timely, and with his wisdom and instruction. And this particular passage strikes me as something really important for all of our, for all of the students that we teach, and a lesson for the world. The world is part of the long invention that is our life, the most important character after ourselves, the coherent place we can name. It exists like a friend, somebody to know, somewhere to feel safe. But it cannot defend itself, and we are destroying it increment by increment at a horrific rate. We must understand that we'll never be able to buy it back. Think of a story in which we came to understand that the complexity of the living world cannot be replicated no matter how much science fiction we hear about cities in space. It would be a story in which it sinks in on everybody that this is the only place we will ever be able to live. If we cherish with proper selfishness whichever dream we inhabit, we must honor our need to revere ourselves and each other. If we want to be happy at all, we might see that we have no choice but compassion. I have been privileged to call Bill my friend, somebody to know, someone to feel safe with, someone to have a drink with at the end of a long evening and tell many stories. And there's a place in the depot that recognizes James Crumley, and there's a James Crumley corner, which Bill often occupies now, and there's a big table that Bill occupies, and people come and spend time with Bill and have a drink with him, and it's a wonderful life to live in a world where you can sit after the end of a long day and hear Bill's stories.
Does this sound okay? One of the first things you notice about Bill, I don't have to tell you, is his magnificent head. And over the years, I've fallen back to the Greek mythology when I think about Bill. You may or may not remember that Zeus, who Bill very much resembles, by the way, minus the beard. Anyway, he developed this horrific headache, and one of the lesser gods decided to split his head open, and out emerged Athena, fully formed. And I think that all of us here on this panel, as well as a number of people out there in the audience, kind of sprung from Bill's forehead, more or less fully formed. Yeah, not however, the embodiment of intellect and wisdom as Athena was, but he did spawn, metaphorically, a great number of writers in this town who have gone on to spread their Kittredgian wisdom all over the country. And so I hope you'll bear with me in the following remarks. They sound like I'm talking about myself, but it's more to get at something about Bill, how grateful I am to him. First of all, I'm grateful that Bill has been around for so long here in town that it allows me to think of myself as one of the younger writers. which is really, I don't know where you fall. So many years ago, after graduating from undergraduate school, I was working on a ranch north of Monarch, living in a 15-foot trailer, and I, out of desperation, sent a story to Bill. And mind you, this is a man who's got anywhere from 20 to 100 students that he's already dealing with. And I sent him a story that was not particularly good, I'm sure. And he wrote me back this very encouraging letter where I was out in the middle of nowhere. And the effect it had on me was very profound. I mean, it was, it put me on a life toward of marginal poverty and heartache, so thank you. But it was, it was an incredible act of generosity, I have to tell you that, and I've never forgotten it, and I never will, Bill. There have been a number of other instances like that over the years where Bill has, and these are things, by the way, that Bill probably doesn't even remember having done, but incredible acts of generosity like that, helping you make connections with editors and magazines and those kinds of things that he was absolutely under no obligation to do. The other thing I want to say about Bill is that how he legitimized my life as a writer, and I think everyone on this panel, to a degree, in that, you know, he was this kid from this ranch country in eastern Oregon, and, you know, I arrived here, I had barely been out of the state by the time I got here as an undergraduate, and here's this guy who's this wonderful writer and teacher from the middle of nowhere, and it made me realize that, you know, hey, maybe what I have to write about has some merit. I remember my friend Paul Zarzinski, who was a knucklehead redneck from Wisconsin. All he wanted to do was play football and ride his motorcycle, and he went to college in some backwater in Wisconsin, and he read a poem by Paul Zimmer about playing football, and suddenly Paul realized, hey, you know, this is about me and my life, and what I like, what I care about has value, and that's what Bill certainly did for me, and I would submit that for all of us up here. So that's mostly what I have to say at the moment, but I'm grateful for this public forum to be able to embarrass Bill and tell him how much I appreciate what he's done for me over the years. And Bill, I hope you live forever.
So do I. Thank you, Deborah and Kim.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. So when I was growing up, my parents are from Alaska and Montana, both very mythic places, but they weren't big readers. And on our bookshelves we had, encyclopedias, a few textbooks from their college days, and The Last Best Place. And so I always grew up seeing that. A lot of my family members, actually, that was one of the few books that they owned. So when I came to UM and I was getting my MFA, I did one extra semester, and lucky me, Bill Kittredge was the Kittredge Fellow that semester. So I think I emailed Karen and Sean like 10 times to make sure I had a spot in that class. And I also knew right away I wanted to ask him to be on my thesis committee, but I was pretty nervous, as I am now. But I remember I went up and I said, Bill, do you want to be on my thesis committee? And he said, no. He waited, he let me fidget there for an agonizingly long time before he said, but I will. Yeah, and so I'm supposed to talk about Bill as a teacher. And the workshops were great, but for me the best part was after every workshop, Bill would have coffee with you the next morning. And you know there's that sacred rule in the workshop where you don't get to talk back when people are saying all this stuff. And the next morning it was like a chance to talk back and say, Bill, but what about this person said this? And hear what he had to say. And he didn't always have an answer for my questions. I was at the end of my MFA, obviously, and had so many things that I had learned bumping around in my head and trying to finish my thesis, and I felt like I had so many anxieties about, should I go this way? Should I go this way? Can I do this? And Bill would really say, well, of course you can. Do you want to? What do you want to do? And there was just something about the questions that he posed to me that really helped clear my head from, the millions of voices I had banging around in there. And so at my thesis reading, this big blizzard blew in that night, and everybody was late except Bill was right on time. And I went up to him to thank him for coming, and I remember he just said, I'll have white wine, please. It was such an honor to have him there, and it's a huge honor to be here. So thank you for having me and congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to echo everything that's been said so far, maybe particularly right now what Kim was talking about. I didn't go to graduate school until I was 35. And so I didn't know really quite what to expect in an MFA program. I did feel instantly, I think, assured on some level because I knew where Bill came from. I knew what he wrote about. I knew him somewhat just socially. But what surprised me right off the bat was, I think it was maybe the first workshop, he handed out a list of stories that we just should read. And for 1985, it was immensely broad. It was, it was Eastern European writers, it was Latin American writers, it was Flannery O'Connor, it was Louise Erdrich, it was, just for, especially maybe for that time, it was many of them I had not read, most I had not read. And I left that first class with this sheaf of stories that I kept referring to ever after. And more than that, it made me, here was a ranch kid from Eastern Oregon, and I was a ranch and little town kid from northern Montana. And what I loved was that the assumption was, you're serious about this craft, you've got to read. You just have to read. That's the bedrock. And so that was huge for me. He taught me that in a very understated sort of way that puzzled me at first, but I think he was largely responsible, you were, for endorsing the idea that the content of what you're writing about is one thing, and that's fine, and it's important, but musicality is also an aspect of a wonderful piece of fiction or nonfiction. And and it was frustrating because on one story I remember you said, I don't know, it's good, I like it, but the end needs one more beat. And I went, what am I supposed to do? What is that one beat? But it went into my head, and I've heard it ever since. Is it working musically? Do the sentences sound good? I remember him saying at one point, if you don't at least risk sentimentality, you're never going to get anywhere. And this idea of being sort of too cool for school and getting all the rules, he had no truck with. And you had to get out there and extend, emotionally, if you were going to come up with anything that would really reach other people, I think. And maybe somewhat related to that is, before my last point, I like to think that sometimes I write funny things, but it's very hard to read funny things because audiences are very careful. They don't know if they're supposed to laugh or not. And so you have to give them cues, or you kind of laugh yourself. Never with Bill in an audience. It was like you get to that funny line and there's this wonderful big roar of laughter. And that was so heartening to me. Just wasn't afraid. Not too cool for an audience either. And then the last thing, the other one big mistake I was making when I was first writing seriously fiction, I was enamored of this idea that I would seem like really deep if my characters didn't do anything really, and so, they just had thoughts. And so I remember one story, it was actually the first story I got published. It ended originally with this woman coming up to a door of a Japanese restaurant, and there's her estranged lover across the room with somebody else. And my idea was, what is she thinking? How does she feel? And Bill read it and went, "Just walk her through the goddamn door." So I'd like to thank you for that and for everything.
Well, I'll respond to one thing you were saying about, you get to the end, and like, what's the next step? You don't want the story to end with both feet standing on the land,
Right.
period.
Yes, right,
Actually,
right.
another story is beginning now, Yeah. Take a couple of steps off into that next story and shut it down, so there's a whole sense of possibility that's coming. The door
Absolutely.
isn't shut on possibility because the story got to a period.
No, don't sign, seal, and deliver it. Yeah. Yeah, that's hugely important. That was to me. And also, I was very honored when Bill retired. I was hired for his position, and I felt it was very, very big shoes. And it has been and continues to be.
Well, I'd like to bounce off a couple of things that Dee mentioned. I think some of the best advice I ever received from Bill in workshops, and this came from my stories, almost every beginning writer story. Everybody wanted to be subtle. We didn't want to say what had happened or show what had happened. I remember one time, Bill said, "Subtlety is always overrated." And I said, "That's really sticks right on. Put it out there, it works, or it doesn't." And when Dee mentioned the story needing one more beat, that musicality that she's talking about, I think the end of Bill's story, the underground river, really epitomizes what she was saying. It has both that directness, there's not too much subtlety in it, and that musicality. Jimmy was screaming, "You killed him, you sons of bitches." And Cleve knew he was killed, and that the wind had stopped, and that he was going down and down the river with Lonnie toward the place where they were capable of infinite resistance. That story ends there. That's where we can learn a lot from Bill as a teacher and from his work. And I'd just like to offer my fellow panelists a chance to add in or maybe say something that occurs to you now, or invite Bill to, and then pretty quickly open up for question and answers. And I'd really like to thank Karen Sham for pulling this panel together.
I too would like to thank Karen Shaw.
Robert, just a word about the, what we seem to have focused in on, that point at which you're both a writer and a teacher. And I think, without getting into any embarrassing specifics, some writers are better at being a teacher than others. I think it's safe to say that writing is really the thing that comes from your heart. And it's very difficult to set that aside and be a good teacher and a good reader and a good listener. But Bill somehow managed to do that with far greater success, I think, than most writer-teachers have been able to do. As far as his teaching style, of course, it's been a number of years, I have to admit, but I don't remember him really focusing that much on specifics. It was more a matter of kind of neck-reining you back into the right direction when you tended to veer off into some ridiculous side road or some kind. And it had very profound effects, and I think many of his pieces of advice seem to have been chiseled in granite in my head over the years, one of which Dee mentioned, which is absolutely essential about risking sentimentality, how important that is. And I think it further illustrates, just from what I know of the writing of the members of this panel, how that has seemed to have sunken into our collective mentality.
I should say something. A lot of those ideas and thoughts and so on and so forth, I got from other people, as we all do.
Right.
first book of stories, second book of stories I ever published. Ray Carver edited the whole goddamn works and marked it all up. Cut out some of my favorite stuff. I didn't know how to write an essay. I've told this story before, I think. 1978, that's getting way after I started teaching here. I got a call from a guy in San Francisco named Terry McDonald, who's one of the great magazine editors, I think, of all time. And he's starting a magazine called Rocky Mountain Magazine out of Denver. And he said, I want you to write an essay. He had read some stories of mine, an essay for my first issue. And I said, great, thank you. I said, except I can't. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't know how. And Terry said, have you got a pen and a piece of paper right there someplace? And I said, yeah. He said, get them, I'll tell you. And he did, on the phone. It took him about 3 minutes. And I taught that model every goddamn class I ever went to, from freshmen to graduate students, forever, you know. Simply is, what's at stake? What's the argument? False solution, real solution, enactment, and consequences. Except there may not be any consequences. And I always say, remember Chinatown, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown.
Well, and there was another version too, and I'm probably grossly oversimplifying it, but isn't it, have your thoughts, tell a story. Have your thoughts, tell a story.
Yeah.
So that you're interrupting whatever larger points you're trying to make with something vivid and grounding and.
Yeah, tell a
and-
story, ground
yeah,
it somewhere.
Tell it.
Let something happen.
Let somebody be with you there.
Yeah, just walk them through the door.
Goddamn door.
Well, what Kim was talking about with the line edits and Bill's edits too, Bill has that knack to zero in on what is barely holding a story back. And I know one time I had a story that I'd worked on a long time and I'd had a lot of near business with it. And Bill, because all he wrote on the story was one passage too melodramatic, and then I had quite a bit of dialogue, and he said 20% too talky through here. Why not 18%? I tried to enact those things and eventually place the story, and I think one of the things I'll always remember Bill summing up, somebody was talking about melodrama. Well, what's the difference between melodrama and drama? And Bill said, melodrama happens to people you don't know. Drama happens to your aunt or your sister or your cousin. And he said you got to make people know those characters and care about them. That's what it is.
Everybody in here, probably a lot of you anyway, know David Gates, and I gave him a copy of this manuscript that I'm working on presently some time ago. And some weeks went by and I asked him for a response, and he said, yeah, simple enough, too much agriculture, not enough scandal. Yeah, I think that's about right. You can only have so much farming in a story.
I had the privilege of working with Bill, and he had his own particular sayings that were memorable. And I remember one student came into my office and she threw an essay down on my desk, and she said, "This is what Bill Kittredge said about my essay." And she goes, "I'm really upset." So I thumbed through the essay and I'm looking for comments. There's not one. It's like a 27-page essay. I get to the end and Bill's comments are, "Too easy!" Exclamation point. And she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I think you better think about it."
Well, there are a lot of wonderful writers came through here, and quite a number of them are in the room right now, or a few, quite a number, I think. And all I can say is that getting this job at the University of Montana, because I was 35 years old, we'd sold the properties in Eastern Oregon, and I took the money I got out of that, went back to graduate school, first at the University of Oregon, and then at Iowa. And about middle of February, that first year in Iowa, I suddenly realized I'd better get a job somewhere. I can't just keep cruising through graduate school. I started writing letters to everybody. Nothing. But I had been the spring before up here in Missoula for a writers conference they used to have every time. There was Missoula, University of Oregon, British Columbia, a couple of other creative writing programs in which the teachers and a couple of graduate students would all get in a Volkswagen bus and all go to a different town. This time it was Missoula. And I met Crumley, and drunken, strange stone things happened. And I didn't bother to write them. I thought I screwed up so badly in Missoula, these people are not gonna want me. I'm sitting there one morning and the phone rings and it's Earl Gantz, who's the director of the writing program here. And he said, Crumley's leaving, he's going to Arkansas, do you want his job? And I said, well, yeah, sure. And I got it. And all I can say is that was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. I came here in the fall of '69, and I've been in Missoula ever since. And a lot of friends, a lot of them here, I think, and God bless you all. You know, it's been a wonderful place to be, still is. You know, I'm having a pretty good time with it, at present.
Well, Bill has a lot of friends, family, former students here today, and so the panelists can add in anything, whatever they want to, but I thought I'd just open it up to questions from you in the audience, or comments, or appreciations, or, you know, Roger hadn't said he might be able to provide some heckling, so whatever.
Roger promised heckling.
Lois.
It just occurs to me as I've listened to you, I think that somebody among you should be the collector of sayings that Bill has made about people's writing. I mean, really the things that you said, if you let them go by, you'll forget them. And he won't tell us.
Well, I have all kinds of things I used to tell classes. One of the first things was, like, I could tell this to freshmen and sophomores. He enforced it. He said, the medium we work in is the reader's imagination. And all this other stuff was just kind of baloney. We're operating in what we're inciting in the reader. And we can't be really sure what we're inciting in the reader, but that's the medium we try to work in. Because we're down to business, you know? If that makes sense. I think it does. You have any questions, somebody? Where are we? Way down there. Mary.
Bill, I long wanted to give you credit for this. We were meeting on the editorial board, and you sort of tossed off as a sideline an exercise that really worked with students, which went like this. Tell them to take two characters, give them a relationship, give them a task to do together, and see what they talk about.
Yeah.
And you said you almost always get a good draft out of that.
Well, the other thing I would say is that have one of them say something to the other one, who kind of objectifies who they are and what's at stake.
Yeah.
That same thing you're saying. But the other thing I would say is, if you can't think of a first question, I'll give you one, which is, where were you last night?
Yeah.
And I told him, I said, if you can't go from there, get out of this class and go to accounting.
A few years ago, I was working with an undergraduate who had the idea that the proper topic for fiction was either bullfighters in Spain or people drinking champagne in Paris.
Yeah,
And to disabuse him of that, I gave him your exercise.
yeah.
And he went away, and pretty soon he came back, and he had written an incomplete draft about two teenagers cutting trail for the Forest Service. The younger one's trying to impress the older one, and the older one wants him to shut up because his parents are getting divorced, and he's upset.
Great.
And then a few years after that, I get an email from him thanking me for making it possible for him to get into a California MFA program. So, on his behalf, thank you.
Well, things have changed. I taught at Irvine a couple of times in recent years. The last time I taught there, and these are brilliant kids. It's a high-end program, you know, in a very expensive area. So, you know, they're all living in Long Beach, quite a ways from Irvine, like 40 miles away from the school. And these are brilliant kids, but they were, I never figured out what in the hell they thought they were doing. And I don't think I ever got them to listen to me. When I got done, I said, I guess that's the end of that, I'm too old. But, you know, we're talking about publishing and not publishing and all that stuff. That world continually changes and continually changes, and you know, and as Annick pointed out, you know, right now I see all these imagery novels of one kind or another, you know, people from Africa moving to New York or some damn thing, I don't know. I don't read them, but that's my fault, not theirs, you know. What else to say? Nothing. Other questions? Statements?
I just want to tell you, I think that everybody's mentioned the things you've given the community, and a couple of things come to my mind that I think have been tremendous for many of us, and one of those is that life is long, okay? That the literary life is a long life, and you come into MFA school and you're in a hurry. And you always you had a real sense of the long game, which was a wonderful gift. And then one thing he's done for this community that I don't think exists in many other communities is you really made it, writing's not a zero-sum game. And there was never this thing like, oh, if he succeeds, then you aren't succeeding or something. You opened it up in a generous way to many of us, in that sense that let's celebrate everybody's success. It all makes us bigger, and that's a big attitude that you shared that I want to thank you for. So.
Well, I thank myself for it too. Steve is a lot of my friends. Thank you, David. What I really mean to say is that yeah, you know, there's all these wonderful people who are trying to do one thing or another, and they're getting somewhere or they're not, and they're having successes, they're having failures. As I said, the manuscript I'm working on right now, my agent sent it back and said she wanted to cut by at least a third. So I've cut 100 pages in the last 3 weeks, and out of a 300-page manuscript, and 330-page manuscript. And I'm having a hell of a good time doing it. You know? But maybe it'll never get published at all. People say, well, who's going to publish it? I'll say, maybe nobody, I don't know. You know? But it's okay. And I think we have to go at it that way, you know. Everybody should be welcomed in and not excluded, you know. They should be, other writers are having some luck, and the writers are not having any luck. You know, there's no difference between, there may be several kinds of differences between them, but basically they should be equally treated, you know, taken care of if we can. If that makes sense. And I agree with you. I'm trying to agree with you. I'm stumbling around quite a bit. Anyway, thank you.
You know, Dave, what you said is kind of the antithesis of what Hugo, I think, said in jest many years ago. Something like, whenever a friend of mine publishes something, a little part of me dies. But Bill was, you're right, David, Bill was very much the opposite of that. And I think he's fostered that kind of a culture in Missoula. Right.
Well, the great thing Hugo said that I remember is he said, nobody can teach anybody how to write. All they can do is help them teach themselves how to write. You know, and I think that's true too.
That sure is.
And of course that sounds more generous than the other thing, but Hugo is, when I first came to town, he was the, whatever anybody wants to think about him, he was the light, you know. He was the main thing. Like Jim come out of Hugo's classes, Rick DeMarinas come out of Hugo's classes, all these people. And I think it was a great stroke of genius. They hired Hugo, took a chance on him. He was 40 years old and never taught a class in his life, and they hired him to come to University of Montana and participate in the MFA program. And Turned out he was a great teacher. And a very funny one, too. I'll shut up about that. But anyway, when I first came here, he was a guiding light for me.
What are you reading right now?
What?
What are you reading right now?
What am I reading? The book I'm going to be reading tomorrow is down at Garth Shakespeare and Company, called Adam and Eve, The Fall of Adam and Eve. It's a book about traditional religions and all the ancient religions, pre-Christian religions. And it, for instance, goes on about how can anybody believe a story about a talking snake?
Stephen Greenblatt.
What?
Stephen Greenblatt?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've read Stephen Greenblatt before, and he's smart as hell, and I love him. So that's what I'm going to be reading. As far as what am I reading in terms of fiction? A lot of detective novels, it seems like, you know. Anything to kind of get me through the evening and put me to sleep. I don't think this is a great time for literary fiction, for instance, you know. In other words, it comes and goes. These things do. And this is a great time for electronic communication or something of that order, you know. And I guess one of the reasons why I'm not reading much fiction is because I can't stand to read on an electric box. So I want something I can handle. Also, I'm getting old, I can't see, and I gotta have something with large print. It's not very complicated. So anyway, that's no answer to your question at all. But thanks for asking it. What else?
I'll testify
Yeah.
as the holder of the Earl Gans chair. You know, a few years ago we were talking about Leslie Fiedler being in Montana. I said how odd it was that he was here and then he was gone. You said, no. There's a generation of people out there in Montana schools that were taught by him at the University of Montana,
Right.
that the influence is still there and it's still percolating out in the community. And I think about that with you and about your influence and about people from Cornell to Irvine are your students, your friends, the enormous, I mean, we're all here in town. We've all had drinks with you. We've all sat in your classrooms and this and that. I think it's easy to underestimate the extent to which your presence as a figure in the American West has had an influence on American writing
Well, that's
over
nice
the last decades. And I'm not kidding. A couple of years ago, the best American short stories, half of the book, was written by writers within 300 miles of where we sit right now. And that's your fault.
Well, I didn't realize that, but it's good to know. And I really still believe that thing about Fiedler going out into, I don't know, Conrad or Sydney or someplace like that, and people bouncing off this mind and somehow...
Yeah, well, the same with you, except on one end is the Pacific and the other end's the Atlantic.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, thank you. That's great. What else? Are we nearing the end of the trail here?
We have time for one or two more questions if people have them, and then.
Well, it's,
Johnny, yes.
I just wondered, you know, what were your sources for the short stories particularly? That's what
What were what?
your sources for those short stories, and the H.L. Davis and people like that.
Yeah, there were a lot of them, you know. When I was at Iowa, I took a short story writing, or short story as a literature class, and it was all short story masterpieces. You remember that anthology? That was one of the best-selling short story anthology ever. It sold about 300,000 copies. The reason it did is because there was a guy at Iowa who taught that class, and every graduate student came out of Iowa, went out over into America, and they all had a great set of notes for that book. And so they taught it themselves. And it's taught all over America. It sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. But that...
Vern Castle?
What?
Is that R.B. Castle?
No, what the hell was the guy's name? R.B. Castle.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that guy. He was a great teacher at Iowa. He had retired before I got there, but yes. But anyway, that great story about open winter set in eastern Oregon. The kid out on the range with an old man herding horses, and they finally herd him into the Dalles and run them down Main Street in the Dalles. They're gonna ship them on the railroad, put them in a corral, and they're going down the Main Street. All the kids in the Dalles have turned out, and they're watching this 14-year-old kid and the old man do it, and they get around, they get the horses corralled. The old man comes over and looks at the kid and he said, "Well, that's it, unless you want to do it one more time." This is John Jackson, one of the first people I got to know in Missoula a long, long time ago. John told me he came out here to study ornithology, but the ornithologists were too boring and he wanted to create writing. That's a long time ago, probably 50 years. Yeah, Jesus. I think it's 49 years ago, John. Anyway, what else? Anything?
Onyx got a question.
Well, it's not a question, it's, you know, you told me this story over and over again about when you were an undergraduate and read the Iliad,
Yep.
and the last line was in thus.
It's a prose translation of the Iliad. I read it in literature class at Oregon State when I was evading.
And thus died Hector, breaker of horses.
Thus they celebrated the funeral games of Hector, breaker of horses.
And that you told me, when you read that, you said, huh, I know some breakers of horses.
That's absolutely true. That was, once in a while you wake up. I mean, I've never heard things like the goddamn Iliad, you know? We didn't have any copies of the Iliad out in Adel. And they still don't, I don't think. But anyway, yeah, that's true. And one of the things I should say about that is what's his name? The guy who taught that class, great. Get old, you can't remember, but anyway, everybody always says they've got a teacher who changed their life. And this guy was a teacher who changed my life. I was so bored. They were teaching general agriculture in ways that I would have been fitted out to be a county agent in Willamette Valley. Nothing they ever taught me in there I ever thought about using out in Eastern Oregon and Warner Valley and so forth. So I knew it was a waste of time. So I had loved Walt Whitman when I was in high school, which was the only thing literary thing I ever liked at all when I was in high school in Klamath Falls. And I saw this class, advertised, and it mentioned Walt Whitman. I thought, shit, I'm going to sign up for that and see what that amounts to. Get me out of, Introduction to Entomology, and, which it did. And Herbert Childs was the guy's name, and the great teacher, and a kind of human being I had never imagined existed. He was an intellectual liberal. You know, I remember he came to class after Dwight Eisenhower defeated Adlai Stevenson, about weeping the next morning. And he said, the last honest man to run for president of the United States has just been defeated. And I'm not sure he wasn't right. But anyway, that guy changed my life. And he's the one who introduced me to the Iliad, and, thus they celebrated the funeral games of Hector, breaker of horses, and it went on from there. When I got out to Adel again, I thought, hey, I could write about these people. It took 20 or 15 years for that to materialize into much of anything, but it did finally. There's long 10 years I didn't do much of writing at all. I thought about it. I always promised myself I was going to be a writer. And when I was 33, I made a decision. I was a kind of wandering drunk by that point. And I'm going to change my life. If I don't change my life, I'm going to hate myself another 30 years or 20 years. And I managed to change my life at least to the point where I tried to write. I was still a wandering drunk for a lot of the time. So anyway, those things happen, and they're guided by somebody like Mary Lou, who's a teacher who touches students that don't react for 20 years, but finally they do sometimes, And I'm sure that's happened to you and hurt everybody who teaches,
Well, you wrote The Breaker of Horses.
What?
Right. And
Breaker of Horses?
that was the first story that I published.
Oh, that's right. You published that story in what was the name of that magazine? The magazine you were editing.
Yeah, it was The Garret.
The Garret, yeah.
Yeah.
And you published,
You gave us a story.
yeah, then you published
I
it.
read that story and I thought, this is incredible. That you would give that to a student magazine, and we published it.
Yeah, I know you
That
did.
story was a real eye-opener.
Well, that was a great student magazine too, and part of it is your fault, you
It was
know?
a pretty good magazine because we had a lot of good writers around.
Well, you published, in the Napville.
Yeah, Edmund Apple,
What was the name of that story? Sea Green Incorruptible.
Sea Green and,
Great long story, very funny.
yes, a story that only Nabokov could have written.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, what else? Something, anything?
It's been 4 or 5 years ago, Bill, you did a reading in the Del Brown room. I'm sure some of you are here who heard that. And you read a part of a novel that I have to say I was absolutely knocked out by. It was by a man who was most definitely not resting on his considerable laurels. It was totally un-Kittredge-like. It was about if I recall right, a retired professional football player.
Yeah, that book's never got,
And, well, that
beyond that.
was the question I was gonna ask, because I badger you, I think, about that every time I see
well,
you.
if I get done with what I'm doing, I'm gonna go back to that.
I hope that's a promise.
Well, it is, because I've got about 5 or 6 other, I mean, if I could get 100 pages out of that, I'd be happy, you know? And that'd be enough for another book of stories with a novella at the end, you know? And, see, that's how writers think. Never mind all this arty stuff, you know? I mean, can I get 100 pages? What else? Well, thank you, everybody. I don't want to dismiss you.
Just, we have one more
We
thing.
have one more thing. At this time, I'm going to have Deborah Magpie Early, the director of our writing program, present this to Bill. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. And I'd like to thank Bill for being up here and participating with us.
Is that a magpie feather?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. I would like to ask you all to stand. In my community and in many communities, when,
If I can, I will.
Bill,
You don't need to. I'm just gonna,
when we honor someone who is important to us and who has accomplished great things, we stand on it. So, Bill, the University of Montana Creative Writing Program recognizes William Kittredge for his long and illustrious career as a writer and educator. This original Lifetime Achievement Award print designed in honor of the occasion was created by David Miles Lusk and presented at the 2017 Montana.
Well, it's wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
The youngest person who got into the last best place was Deborah Magpie.
I'm 16.
13 at the time? 9. Thank you very much. God bless you all.